Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. I'm Ross, and I'm live from the Athenaeum in Jackson, Louisiana, home of the HOREB Institute for Historical and Objective Research and Exploration of the Bible, and home of United Israel World Union Center South. Thank you very much for joining me today for my class on Passover, the Forgotten Festival. Passover, the Forgotten Festival. We are in an annual a year-long study of the annual cycle of Torah readings, following basically through the Torah cycle readings every week, week after week, in a series called Pentateuch in Perspective. We're covering a period known as the life and laws of Moses. We're in the book of Exodus. We are in Torah portion, Parsha Bo. Parsha Bo covers from Exodus chapter 10, verse 1 through 13, verse 16. Again, Passover, the Forgotten Festival. I want to begin today just reading a couple of short sentences, a few short sentences, the description of the class, because I want to set the tone, I want to set it right, then we're going to jump into this. So basically, Passover is introduced as part of the Exodus narrative. Passover is commanded as an annual observance, a lasting memorial of deliverance. Yet despite this charge, the Hebrew Bible records only a handful of observances and even reports that it was forgotten entirely for centuries. And what we're going to do in this class is we're going to examine the biblical record of Passover's institution in the book of Exodus chapter 12. And then we're going to go through the various Passovers that are mentioned in Scripture. We're going to talk through them briefly. We're setting up for what I consider to be, what I expect to be, a very engaging discussion after the class on a Zoom call. So I hope you'll stick with me on that. So we're talking about Passover because this is where we meet Passover in the biblical narrative. Now, Passover in English, if you just do a search for the word Passover in English, you're going to find that that word occurs 45 times in 42 verses. 45 times in 42 verses. But if I switch that and I look for the Hebrew word Pesach, so Passover is the English translation of the Hebrew Pesach. If I look for Pesach, I find it 49 times in 46 verses. So what that tells us is that sometimes Pesach, the word translated Passover most of the time, sometimes the word Pesach appears in Hebrew and it's not translated Passover when it's translated into English. So that's part of what we have to figure out. We have to think about and work through the various examples in the text to figure out, A, what does the word mean, and how else could it possibly be translated? Now, when we say today, when we talk about Pesach or Passover, what generally comes to mind is the festival, the Chag, the festival of freedom, a festival associated with deliverance, the time of our freedom. And really, one of the things that I want to point out initially, if we follow the biblical priestly writers, what we come away with is that Pesach bridges, if you will, a time of servitude to Pharaoh, a time of servitude and slavery to Egypt, and a transition to not freedom necessarily, but servitude or slavery yet again, but this time to a different master. Slavery to Pharaoh is replaced by slavery to God. Servant to become a servant of God and to denounce and get away from this human ruler. Now, throughout the narrative, throughout the Exodus narratives, one of the things that we find over and over is that Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh, and they use the same phrase over and over, almost exactly. The Hebrew is shalach et ami, generally translated as let my people go. Now, I know that different people might translate this differently. To shalach is a verb that means to send forth. And so I see this more as a command to Pharaoh rather than a request. It's not saying, hey, would you please let my people go? It's more of send forth my people, shalakatami. And over we see that. Now, it's not just said just as a statement with nothing tied to it. Quite often, the command, as I would put it, to let my people go, to send forth my people, it's so that they may serve me. Now, you can read it like I just said it, so that they might serve me, or you could read it like this, that they might serve me. You see the subtle nuance there. It's you are, Pharaoh, currently oppressing my people. So he says, send them forth and they might serve me. Now, one of the things that I'd like to do is say that, in fact, we'll put these verses in the chat because I'm not going to read them, but these are the occurrences, these are the passages where it says, send them forth that they might serve me. I'm just going to read the verses. You'll see them. You can write them down. Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. Exodus 4, 23. Exodus 7, 16. 8, 1. 8:20, chapter 9, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 13, chapter 10, verse 3 and 26. Even the Egyptians, I know you have a few more, I'm about to tell you why that is. Even the Egyptians began to say to Pharaoh, hey, send them forth. Let them serve him, right? So even the courtiers, as sometimes the Old English, the authorized English tells us, sometimes even they, the officers of Pharaoh, are encouraging Pharaoh, just let the guys go. Let them all go. Get them out of here. So, but again, we're constantly faced with Pharaoh feels the weight of the plague or the blow, and then sort of kind of feels like, okay, I have to do something. And then he hardens his heart, or his heart is hardened, as the Hebrew might be more likely to suggest, that is resolve is committed. Once you commit to not letting them go, God just strengthens that resolve of Pharaoh. But one plague finally does the trick. One plague, according to the priestly biblical writers, puts Pharaoh and all of Egypt on their knees. And that is what I'm going to talk about first this morning. But before I get into that particular plague, I will say that we have 3 different plague lists in the Hebrew Bible. These also we'll put in the chat. Now, here's the deal. We have from Exodus chapter 7 through Exodus chapter 12. Those chapters cover 10 plagues. If you read from Exodus chapter 7 through Exodus 12, you will encounter 10 plagues. And those are the ones that most people are familiar with. It's the ones that generally appear in movie and article. They're the ones that most writers and authors and creators refer to, documentaries and so forth. This list, Exodus 7 to 12, 10 plagues. If, however, we go to 2 other passages in the Bible, we get different lists with different plagues. We get some that are missing in certain lists, and the order is not the same. So, for instance, in Psalm 78, verses 43 through 51, we don't get 10 lists. We don't get a list of 10 plagues. Psalm 78, verse 43 through 51, we get 7 plagues. 7 plagues. And here's what's missing in Psalm 78 that's present in Exodus 7 through 12. The gnats or the lice, however your translation reads that, the boils, and darkness. So those 3 are missing in Psalm 78. And you might say, well, it's a poetic rendering. It's just to make things flow, and the writer there is not trying to be exact. Okay. whatever. I'm just suggesting to you that we have to review all of these if we're going to understand the plagues and the Exodus narratives. The order, by the way, is different in Psalm 78 than it is in Exodus chapter 12. Now, if we look at Psalm 105, verse 26 through 36, which is our third list of the plagues, here we get 8. We get 8 plagues here. Boils and livestock disease are missing in this particular account. Psalm 105 is missing boils and livestock disease. Also interesting is that in this list, in Psalm 105, darkness occurs first. So the biblical writers are taking liberties in recording these particular blows or these particular plagues. Now, some have argued that these discrepant representations of the plagues indicates that they're not certain, that somehow lost in antiquity are an accurate record. One thing that we get very consistently throughout the Hebrew Bible, present not only in the Hebrew Bible and the Tanakh, but also present in the Moses Scroll and other Dead Sea Scrolls, is that Pharaoh is hammered, basically, and hit, that there are certain incredible wonders that he is smitten with, if you will. But one detail is consistent in the Tanakh that I want to focus on because it's going to set us up for the material I want to cover today. If you look at Exodus 7 to 12, if you look at Psalm 78, if you look at Psalm 105, the one plague that is very precise in the same place in all 3 accounts is, drum roll, the death of the firstborn. It is the final plague in all 3 accounts. The death of the firstborn in Egypt, and this is the blow. This is the plague that basically brings about a buckling of the knees, we might say. So I want to look at a couple of passages. I want us to go to Psalm 78, verse 51. Psalm 78 and verse 51. And I just want to read this particular passage. I'm not going to read the whole list, but I already gave you the references. And smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tents of Ham, or Ham. So very clearly, this is the final plague. What we see next in Psalm 78 is, but he led forth his own people like sheep, etc. So the last plague, before leading the people out, is a blow to the chief of their strength, all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Now, the next passage I'd like to look at is Psalm 105, verse 36. Let's look at Psalm 105 and verse 36. He smote also all the firstborn in their land, the chief of all their strength, and he brought them forth, you see. So again, the last blow is striking down the strength of Egypt, all the firstborn. Now that's the same in Psalm 78. It is the same in Psalm 105. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail. And I want to go back to the Exodus account in Exodus chapter 12. We're going to be dealing with this. But before we go there, I want to take us back even a little bit further. So if you have your Exodus Torah tablet, go with me to page 20, which is Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. Now, by the way, this is when Moses encounters God at Har HaElohim, at the mountain of God, at HOREB, and God is telling him what he is to do. He's giving him his mission. And Moses is giving reasons why he should not be the one to take on this task. You know, you're reminded of your mission should you choose to accept it. Well, he doesn't want to accept it. So what we have here is one of the charges that God gives to Moses, and here it is in verse 22, when he tells him basically, let me look at verse 21 first. And Jehovah said unto Moses, when you go back into Egypt, see that thou do before Pharaoh all the wonders which I've put in your hand, but I will harden his heart, he will not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith Jehovah, Israel is my son, my firstborn, and I have said unto thee, let my son go that he may serve me, and thou hast refused to let him go. Behold, I will slay thy son, thy firstborn. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is he's not been to Pharaoh yet. Notice the way this is worded, and you can check the Hebrew, but the wording here suggests that he's already been before Pharaoh. But what I'm going to talk about today is, be that as it might be, we're going to look through the narrative and we're going to see when is this message delivered. Because he never, at least according to the biblical text, Moses never says these exact words. He doesn't say, Israel is my son, my firstborn, let him go, and if you don't let him go, or since you haven't let him go, I'm going to kill your firstborn son. However, the subject that we're dealing with now is the death of the firstborn. So we're going to see what we can find. What are the biblical priestly writers trying to show us that ties these points together? What I'm going to suggest is that according to the narrative flow, that there is a delivery of this message in sort, but it's delayed, okay? So we're going to go through a few passages. Let's look at Exodus chapter 11, verses 4 and 5. That's going to be on page 62 if you have the tablet. Exodus chapter 11, verse 4 and 5. And by the way, if you don't have the Exodus tablet, the link is in the description so you can get that. Verse 4, and Moses said, thus saith Jehovah, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of cattle. Okay? None are exempt. I know in our minds sometimes we say, well, you know, if the Egyptians were good Egyptians, and I'm reading the text, all firstborn in Egypt will die. All right? Now look at chapter 12 and verse 12, which is going to be on page 66 of the Torah tablet. For I will go through the land of Egypt in that night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Jehovah. Again, I'm reading the ASV, so you might say Yahweh or Yehovah. You might not pronounce the name. You might say Hashem. ASV. What I want to do, and the reason I use the ASV is because I want to get at least some recognition that behind the English translation, there is a Hebrew word which happens to be the name as it's communicated in the biblical text. Now, one more passage in Exodus chapter 12, and that's going to be in verse 29, Exodus 12:29, which is page 70 of the Torah tablet. And it shall come to pass at midnight that Jehovah smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. So one of the things that we see in the text, and we'll talk more about this in the after class discussion, is that this is a consistent point that comes across, that the firstborn will be smitten. And in the text that I just read, all three of those texts, very clearly it is Jehovah who will slay the firstborn. From the top chair to the lowest pit, every firstborn in the land of Egypt. So this is a gruesome blow. Now, Israel was to be distinguished, to be set apart from the Egyptians, right? So what I want to do now is to very clearly show that while this is going on, nothing is to happen to the children of Israel. We're talking about Passover. What is Passover really about? So look with me at Exodus chapter 11, 6 through 8, which is on page 62. 6 through 8. Now, by the way, if you notice, I just read to make the point of God killing all the firstborn in this chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. Now we're in verse 6 through 8. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there hath not been, nor shall be any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know how that Jehovah doth make a distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me and bow themselves down unto me, saying, Get thee out and all the people that follow thee, and after that I'll go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Now, the question is, in other words, I'm building the story a certain way. Now, most of us are familiar with the story, but I wanted to establish that God had told Moses to warn Pharaoh that because you haven't let my son go, Israel, his firstborn, that he will kill the firstborn of Egypt, from Pharaoh to the handmaids and so forth, all the way down, every firstborn, including the firstborn of the animals. Now, the question is, what is going to distinguish between the firstborn of Egypt and their animals and the firstborn of Israel? What is it that sets those apart? How will they be distinguished? And the answer is that lamb's blood would be smeared, according to the biblical priestly writers, that lamb's blood would be smeared upon the mezuzot, the doorpost of the house. So if you, an Israelite, wanted to keep God from killing the firstborn, the lamb's blood would be smeared upon the mezuzot. Now, many of you have heard of a mezuzah. It's in modern, the way we think of it now, it is generally a small decorative piece that's placed on the doorpost. And within that, there are certain commandments. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. But that's not the only place that mezuzah or mezuzot is used. Here, it means the doorpost, and that's what it means there as well. We just tend to describe the object as a mezuzah because it goes on the doorpost. Okay, so let's look at three passages which discuss blood on the doorpost according to the priestly writer. Look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 7 first, and that is on page 64, 12:7. And they shall take of the blood and put it on the two side posts and on the lintel upon the houses wherein they shall eat it. Okay? I'm not going through the whole procedure of the Passover right now. I'm just dealing with the blood. Take the blood, smear it on the two side posts. Okay? And then look at verse 13, which is on page 66 of the tablet. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and there shall no plague be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. So here, notice the phrase, pass over you. In other words, you're going to smear the blood on the two side posts, and when God is passing through, some texts use the phrase, the destroyer, okay? But other texts clearly indicate that it is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, whether he's doing that through the agency of a destroyer or not. But in other words, if he sees the one doing the killing, if he sees the blood on the doorpost, he says, I will pass over you. Now, in the Hebrew, that word is Pesach. The root word is Pesach. Pei, Samik, Het. Now, this word, we're going to talk more about in the discussion afterwards, but we translate it into English as Passover, but it's debated. In other words, what does it really mean? There are quite a few passages in the Hebrew Bible where it indicates a meaning something like halt or limp. You know, so you can almost imagine this destroying force, God or God's agent in the destruction, going from house to house and looking at the doorpost, halting just long enough to make that, and then moving on if the blood is found. So we see this, and that's what the passage is suggesting. That's what the word actually means. And then there are a couple of other meanings, but we'll get into that. Some have suggested a meaning of protection, but I think the basic core meaning is to halt or to limp. And then we'll have to deal with that a little bit more detail in the after. So look now at verse 22 and 23, which is on page 68. For Jehovah will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two side posts, and if you didn't get the memo, the other text said the side posts. Here it's on the lintel and the side post. Jehovah will pass over the door and will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your house to smite you. All right. Now, the blood on the door, the word that we use to describe the blood on the door, it's apotropaic, which is basically, it means something which has the power to avert evil influence. It's a word that we use to describe something that, a lot of times people use an amulet or some sort of, device or some sort of object which they believe will scare away anything bad that's coming. In fact, there are a lot of people today, who think of a mezuzah in this sense, that it keeps out any bad. And if there's any mistake, if the spelling or if one letter is wrong, very mystical understanding. But according to the priestly writers, this blood on the doorstep or on the lintels, and the lintel on the side post is enough to keep the destroyer and or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Jehovah, from killing the firstborn. Now, what kind of blood are we talking about? We're talking about the blood of the lamb. We're talking about the blood of the lamb of the Pesach, and the Pesach is what we're now going to switch our focus to. We've kind of worked it from the sides, and now we're going to deal with the actual Passover, right? Again, Passover is translated The word is translated as Passover 45 times in 42 verses. But in the Hebrew, one more, so you have this in your notes, Pesach, the root word that's translated as Passover that many times, the Hebrew word appears 49 times in 46 verses. This means the Hebrew is not always translated as Passover. Now, I looked at every occurrence this week preparing this class of the English word Passover and every occurrence of the Hebrew word Pesach, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, because I wanted to understand from the biblical writer's perspective everything that the Bible says about this Chag. If you're trying to write this down in English in your notes, Chag is a word that is used, it's translated most often as festival, but it's C-H-A-G. But notice I'm not being very harsh on the C-H. I'm not saying Chag. It's not quite that harsh. It's almost like a heavy H, Chag. But this Chag, called the Passover, was to be celebrated annually on the 14th of the first month, which is described as Aviv. Now, Aviv is used in the text 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, Aviv, and we're not going to go into much detail on that at this point. The Pesach was to be killed. Like a lot of people today, we talk about keeping Passover. More biblically, one might say killing Passover than keeping Passover, because it was killed, it was eaten, but you say kept, we're going to see maybe one example where that might be the case. But most often in the Hebrew, when it talks about the Pesach, it's associated with a verb, asah, to do the Passover. Now, how do you do the Passover? You kill it, you eat it. That's how you do it. And oh, by the way, you got to keep that blood, because the blood has to be smeared on the lintel and the doorpost, or in some cases, the doorpost. Now, one of the things that I want to make very clear is that in antiquity, there was a distinction to be made, and the biblical writers hold this to be true, and they present it this way. There's a distinction between Pesach and unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is after. It begins, you have the Passover, when the destroyer, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, when God comes through and kills the firstborn, that night of watching, if you will, when that's the Passover. They kill, they eat, they kill it between the evenings, the 14th. They eat it, right? Blood on the doorposts and so forth. And then the next day begins the unleavened bread. So again, these are to be distinguished. But one thing that needs to be said is that this Pesach was to be kept eternally. All right, I'm going to look at 3 passages in the book of Exodus to make this point. Again, I'm not talking about unleavened bread here, but go to Exodus 12:14, which is page 66. Exodus 12:14, and this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. All right. Now, we know, we've discussed in other classes, that olam is an indeterminate age, is more a literal rendering of the passage. But a lot of times we see eternally or forever in the English. But technically, I'm not so against that translation, because it's like, it's saying you're going to keep doing this. There's no end. It's perpetual is probably a good translation. To an age, just how far is it? Just keep on doing it, right? This is the idea. Now look at verse 24, which is on page 70. Verse 24, actually it looks like it begins at the very end of 68. And ye shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever. Forever, okay? And that's dealing, by the way, with the blood. You're going to put the blood on the side post. How often do we do this? How about this? Forever. You're going to do this forever. Now, look at verse 42, which is on page 72 of the Torah tablet. Talking about this night where this is done, it is a night to be much observed. There the word is guarded. You know, it's sometimes translated as kept. Guarded unto Jehovah for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of Jehovah to be much observed of all the children of Israel. When? For how long? Throughout their generations. Throughout their generations. Okay. Now, but was it? I mean, it says in those three passages very clearly, you're going to do this, do this. How long do we do it? Throughout your generations, from one generation to the next. You're going to do it forever, over and over and over. We're told that three clear texts that the Passover, this sacrifice, this killing of the lamb, the whole ritual was to be done forever. Now, I know that there are some people, since it's not being done now, that say, well, it wasn't that part of the Passover that was to be done forever. Go back and read those texts, all right? We certainly don't get from the Bible that this festival was done. I'm using what the Hebrew says, do the Pesach. It wasn't done consecutively without miss. In fact, we're going to see something totally different, actually. We have the original Exodus account. And then, now what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to read these, but just get a Bible with me, just so you get the feel and you can go through with me. And I'm just going to show you where the next one is and the next one and so forth. So if you go from Exodus 12, the next one is mentioned in Numbers chapter 9. Now, I'm not going to read this, but if you put this in your notes, if you go to Exodus chapter 9, the next one is here. And they're going to keep the festival on the 14th day of the first month, the second year of the Exodus. So they kept it, they left, according to the priestly biblical writer. And then a year later, Numbers chapter 9, it says they're going to keep another one. Now, according to Numbers chapter 9, there were some people who were not prepared to keep it, right? And so, but they wanted to keep it. So an amendment, if you will, was made that said, if for some reason, and the stipulations are given in Numbers chapter 9, you're not prepared, you're on a journey and so forth, you can't keep Pesach in the first month, 14th day, you're to do the Passover exactly the same, but do it in the second month, 14th day. That's what Numbers chapter 9 is about. It's called Pesach Shni, the second Passover. And then we have, I guess, 38 more years in the wilderness, and we get no more mentioned. Notice how I said that, no more mentioned. You might say, well, Ross, what did you expect it was going to say? And this is Passover number 3, and this is 4, and this is 5. You know, that's not even good storytelling. But we don't see any other account given in the Pentateuch, and the question has to be, why? Now, go to Joshua chapter 5. Again, we're not going to read these. I'm just giving you a few passages because I want you to study these on your own. We'll get into some of this after. But in Judges chapter 5, this is after the death of Moses, and the children of Israel are passing into the land under Joshua's leadership. Now, Joshua has to do a couple of things to get back on track, basically, with the people. one, he has to do a mass circumcision. Now, this is strange because no one who left Egypt, remember, the group died off because, according to the priestly biblical writers, they committed some grave offenses and, they wouldn't go up into the land and so forth, and they doubted God. And anyway, so they die off, but there's no circumcisions being done, which is strange. And I've read various explanations. Some people say, well, it's not so hygienic to do circumcisions in the desert. That's the whole Bible. Where else are they going to do it? They couldn't go to, a clinic with clean, sterilized. I mean, this is where you would do it if you're going to do it. But they didn't. They didn't do any circumcisions. And then we get in Joshua 5 a mass circumcision. And then it says that they kept the Passover in verse 10. They kept it in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho, and so forth. And then, by the way, the manna stops there, and they begin to eat of the grain of the land, as it says. So the question, I guess, one question that we'll have to entertain later is, in the discussion, why is it that they're not circumcising? We get this weird story in Exodus chapter 4 where Moses didn't circumcise his boys. People say they know what it means, but it's very strangely worded. We don't know if the killing, if the baby is going to be killed, if Moses is going to be, it's kind of an unclear antecedent, the language, we can't tell who's been killed and so forth. But anyway, Zipporah circumcises the baby and throws the foreskin down. But then we don't see any circumcisions. In fact, in Deuteronomy, we only see circumcision mentioned twice, in Deuteronomy 10 and Deuteronomy 30. And both of those cases are circumcision of the heart. What's that about? Not sure. Okay. So let's say, and again, this depends on how you date the Exodus. It depends. Some people date it 1500s, some people earlier, but most, these are the primary dates, 1500s, some to the 1200s. So, where do you put it? But let's just say, so that I can continue to talk, that we're talking about 1400 when Joshua crosses into the Promised Land, okay? We're dealing now with an interesting point. We see no circumcisions from the time of Joshua, biblically. I'm talking about biblically. We don't see a single example of, I'm not going to say circumcision. What I meant to say was Passover observances for 700 years. 700 years. That's a mighty long time. None. We have no example, no record in the Bible of anyone keeping a Passover observance. There's no Passover observance until we get, strangely enough, all the way down to the time of Hezekiah. By the way, now we're going to look at this. If you don't have this, you need to go to rossknichols.com. It's on my resources page. It's called A Synoptic Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles by Newsom. Very interesting. I use it all the time. Look at, if you have it, it's on page 219 and 220. Now, this deals with the next, from the time of Joshua, this is the next time we're dealing with Passover, biblically. And Hezekiah, it's Second Chronicles chapter 30, verses 1 through 27, if you don't have this particular book. But it's only mentioned here, right? And whenever you read this, the people weren't ready, and so they're keeping the second Passover that was described in Numbers chapter 9, here in Second Chronicles chapter 30. I encourage you to read it. It's a great story. It's written by the court of Judah, we think. Chronicles has a way of presenting material that's not always given in the book of Kings, right? We're going to see an example of that in a moment. But the bottom line is, I'm not going to read through the whole story, but just to hit the high points, basically, this story says that after all these years, they decided that they were going to do a Passover, and the people weren't ready. But I'm going to suggest that it was at least this long between observances, and I'm actually going to show you something that says it's longer. So just stick with me. I'm following the text. This is the order. Hezekiah is the next one that's mentioned as observing it. Now then, after Hezekiah's Passover, we biblically, again, I'm talking biblically, some of you might want to believe that they did it every year, they just didn't report it. You're going to have to come up with a better answer than that in just a moment. But here we go. So if we look at the biblical text, after Hezekiah, we have the following kings: Manasseh, Ammon, and then Josiah. I'm telling you a lot of books that I recommend, and these aren't my books. I'm just recommending them because people often ask me, hey, what's the best Bible out there? If I want to get a Bible, and I've told people that I really like, for a total Bible, an academic Bible, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha, and I have that on my website as well. But there's an interesting note. So if I wanted to say, let's say that the Passover is observed in the time of Hezekiah, and then it's not kept again until Josiah's time, and by the way, that's what I'm saying. How long is that? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, because if you look at the chart here, and this is standard, I have behind me a bookshelf full of different chronologies, different biblical chronologies, various people working out, the discrepancies and the difficulties in determining this reign and that reign, and their co-regents, and every one of these books, by the way, they're different, but they all say, I got it figured out, I cracked the code. This is an honest footnote. It says the data are inconsistent for the dates of the reigns of Achaz, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. So I agree with that. They're inconsistent. The data are inconsistent. But here's what we know. If we had to put kind of a number, a guesstimate, you know what a guesstimate is, on Manasseh, we would say his reign lasted 45 to 56 years. Ammon is kind of easy. He's got 1 year and he's whacked. He's killed. He's assassinated. And then we have Josiah, and Josiah's Passover takes place in the 18th year, okay? So if we work through this, if you add all that up, we're talking about it's probably 60 to 70 years between the Passover of Hezekiah and the Passover of Josiah. So, it's difficult. Now what I'd like to do is, again, look at your Synoptic Harmony, Newsom, page 252 to 254. Now, if you don't have this book, that's fine, because I'll give you the chapter and verses. We're basically dealing with the account of the Passover of Josiah's day, which is recorded in 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 35. Okay. Now, I just want to go over a couple of points. If you're looking at Newsom's book, which is so helpful, the Passover being renewed, Kings says the following. 2 Kings 23, verse 21 starts this way. And the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. The Hebrew there is Sefer HaBrit. The book of the covenant, that phrase is only used 4 times in Scripture. Exodus 24:7, 2 Kings 23, verse 2, verse 21, and then 2 Chronicles 34:30. The book of the covenant book. Now, according to 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 34, the book of the covenant scroll, is what was discovered in the time of Josiah, right? Chronicles doesn't have that particular phrase. Interesting. And then 2 Chronicles 35, verses 1 through 17, gives a major section that's not mentioned at all in Kings. Chronicles gives a huge record of the Passover of Josiah that's just not mentioned in Kings. Very interesting, and it shows in this book. Again, this is page 253. Now, just a couple of high points. One of the things that I find interesting is that in 2 Chronicles 35, at this Passover, they killed the Passover and so forth, Josiah tells the Levites, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. You no longer need to carry it on your shoulders. Now, I have an answer for that, but it's very interesting. What do you mean, put the ark in the temple? You don't have to carry it on your shoulders anymore. I thought it was put in the temple in the time of David. That's an interesting puzzle, but that requires a little more time than we have right now. So then in verse 7 and following, just get a load of these numbers. The lambs and kids from the flock to the number of 30,000, 3,000 bulls. These were from the king's possessions. And then other people donated Passover offerings, 2,600 lambs and kids and 3,000 bulls. Verse 9, Coniah also and Shemaiah and Nathanael, his brothers, and Hashabiah and Jael and Jozabad, the chief of the Levites, gave to the Levites for Passover offerings 5,000 lambs and kids and 500 bulls. Whew, lot of animals there. Okay, and it goes on to describe. Then it says, verse 16, so all the service of the Lord was prepared that day to keep the Passover and to offer burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord according to the command of King Josiah. This is Josiah's Passover. Now I want to read one passage. It's also in this synoptic harmony, but I want to look at side by side. We have a passage in 2 Kings 23, 22, and 2 Chronicles 35, verse 18. And here's what it says. For no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel. I'm reading Kings. Or during all the days of the kings of Israel or of the kings of Judah. No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel or during all the days of the kings of Israel or of the kings of Judah. Now, here's the way most people read this. They say, well, yeah, they didn't keep it right, but they kept it. Somebody, a righteous remnant, kept it, and people go through all sorts of sacred gymnastics to try to justify what the biblical writers don't try to justify, that it wasn't kept. The idea is that it wasn't kept. Now, Kings, this is interesting, King says, if you look back and you're looking at the kings of Israel, did anybody keep it? What about the kings of Judah up until Josiah? No. Wait a minute. The kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, they didn't keep it like this? You go, see, there's that word again, like this, meaning, this way an apologist will take this, well, they didn't keep it like this was a really good one. But that's not what it's saying. Now, let's look at the Chronicles reading. 2 Chronicles 35 says, no Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Josiah and the priests and the Levites and all Judah and Israel who were present and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year, this is where it reads the same for Kings and Chronicles. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, this Passover was kept, King says, to the Lord in Jerusalem. Now, let me point out something here. One thing that's striking is Kings says none of the kings of Israel or Judah kept it. Chronicles says none of the kings of Israel kept it. Well, this is an example. This is why we have to understand context and culture and who's writing the text. Well, Chronicles can't say that no king of Judah kept the Passover because Chronicles has already reported that Hezekiah did. You see, Kings doesn't have that. Only Chronicles has that. Here's what I think. I think I trust the writer in Kings here over the writer of Chronicles, and I think that there's a reason to do so. We have no record, biblical record, of any king of Israel keeping Pesach. Now think about that. No king of Israel. No king of Israel. None who kept the Passover. And you go, well, that's obvious, Ross. They're all wicked. Pretty much. Okay. Well, you go, well, did we have any prophets in the north? We did. Did any of those? Do we have any record in the history of the north of Israel, in the kingdom of Israel, the house of Israel? We have any record of anybody keeping the Passover? No. Of doing the Pesach ritual. We have no record of king or prophet in the north. We have no record of any prophet of Judah mentioning Pesach at all. Think of all the southern prophets. You know, if you think of Isaiah, Micah, work your way down. Joel, Nahum. I mean, who of all the prophets, in north or south, is there any mention of anybody keeping the Passover? Again, Chronicles, Second Chronicles, chapter 30, does have Hezekiah do Pesach Sheni, but it's not mentioned in Kings by the writer of Kings. And then later, Kings here in chapter 23, verse 22, says none of the kings of Israel or Judah kept it. And then you say, well, Second Chronicles 35 can't say that, again, because Hezekiah reportedly kept it. Kings and Chronicles push the previous observance of Pesach to either the time of when the judges ruled or to Samuel. Same time frame, right? If you read the account in Kings and Chronicles, so we're talking about the 18th year of Josiah, right? If you go from that point in the 7th century BCE, if you ask them, when's the last time it was kept? They say the time of the judges. Did you say the time of the judges? And he said, yeah, like the time of Samuel. We're talking hundreds of years. So, but if we read our text from the time of Samuel and the judges, we don't find a single mention of Passover being kept. I mean, it just isn't there. Now, you have one other observance in the Bible, Ezra chapter 6. In Ezra chapter 6, there's a description of a Passover, talking about the exiles. Here's one of the main points that's going to lead us into what I think is going to be a very fun discussion, and that's this. the inconsistencies in the story should give us pause. Whether we're talking about the plagues, their number, their order, their arrangement, which plagues, the fact that those plagues aren't really mentioned in later accounts. When we look at this from a historical, critical perspective, we ought to have questions. One thing that's very consistent is that Israel was brought forth from the land of Egypt. In other words, they were in Egypt. A body of people came out. We have to ask certain questions around the historical, critical side. How many? Some texts say 600,000. Some texts say 603,550. In fact, that occurs several times. But that's just the men. So, but some have proposed, like if you do the math, if there's 603,550 men, plus women, children, so forth, you're looking at 2.7 to 3 million people. But some have looked at that and said, you know, that's the size of Brisbane, Australia. That's the size of Chicago, around the size of Houston. Is that possible? Of course, the fundamentalist apologists will say, well, that's what it says and that's what it means. But is it? We have to look at the text and say, well, maybe it says Aleph is translated 1,000. Maybe that means clan. So instead of 603,000, maybe it's 603 clans, which is still a big number of people. But we have to look at these texts and we have to honestly assess, and we have to say, let's be honest to Moses, let's be honest with the text. We have to be honest here, and one thing that we have to be honest about is that Passover, the celebration that's described by the priestly biblical writer, seems to be unknown throughout the biblical period until the command of Josiah. Now, what does that mean? Join me in the Zoom. If you are a member of our Yachad, meet me in the Zoom. If you're not yet a member of the Yachad, don't worry. You'll be with us for about 45 minutes today on a YouTube video of that discussion beginning at around 12 noon Central Time. If you don't have the link to that YouTube, you'll be directed. If you're not, or you make a mistake and click off, look in the description of this video and you'll get that. Don't forget, join us on Thursday nights. Jono Vandor, Ezra, our Chat GPT-driven techspert, as we call him, created by Seth, and me. Join us together on Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. I'll see you in the Zoom. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.